welcome back to Weird on the Rocks. This is a podcast that explores the weird, unusual, strange, and unexplained, all while getting our drink on. I'm your host, Katie. So today's episode might be a little different from some of the other topics I've covered because it isn't true crime and it isn't anything necessarily weird or creepy, but I'm going to be discussing corporate fraud and specifically the story of Elizabeth Holmes and her company Theranos. This story has been widely covered over the past year or so, and I find it extremely intriguing, and I hope that you guys do too. And if you do enjoy it, God knows there are plenty of other fraud cases out there that I can cover in the future, so just let me know if there's something that you want me to talk about. I also want to say a quick thank you to everyone who has listened and supported my show so far. I just reached a big milestone of 10,000 listens, which blows my mind. My audience number right now is 440, which means that there are 440 loyal listeners who are coming back every 2 weeks to listen, and that's just crazy. Compared to lots of other podcasts, my number is just laughable. But to me, it's a big deal, as nerdy as that sounds. And whenever I start comparing myself to other shows, I like to imagine 440 people in a room. And that just seems incredibly overwhelming. There's no way I could get up and speak in front of that many people. So it really puts it into perspective for me. So if you're a friend, a family member, another podcaster that I've talked to and become friends with, or just someone who found my show and enjoys it for whatever reason, thank you. I love making the show and I'm glad that you guys are enjoying it too. If you would like to find my show, I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Weird on the Rocks Podcast, Twitter at Weird_Rocks, and the website weirdontheRocks.weebly.com. As always, you can find pictures from today's episode and all of my research links on the website. Before we get into the good stuff tonight, I want to share this week's beverage of choice. Tonight, I'm drinking a Bay Breeze, which is actually the first drink I ever ordered at a bar on my 21st birthday, or my friend ordered it for me because I had no idea what I was doing. It has vodka, cranberry juice, pineapple juice, and lime, and it's definitely an oldie but a goodie. If I go to the bar and I don't know what to order, this is always a good go-to drink for me. All right, well, let's get into it. Cheers, and let's get weird. In 2015, Forbes magazine named then 31-year-old Elizabeth Holmes as the youngest and wealthiest self-made woman billionaire in America. This prestigious title was awarded to Holmes based off of her $9 billion company called Theranos. So why, within just 2 years, did Fortune magazine name her one of the world's most disappointing leaders? Elizabeth Holmes was born in Washington, D.C. in 1984. Her father, Christian Holmes VI, was the vice president of Enron, and her mother, Noelle Doust, was a congressional committee staffer. The family was very prestigious and affluent, and from an early age, Elizabeth wanted to follow in her parents' footsteps. When she was 7, she created the drawings and plans for her own time machine, and by the age of 9, she was telling friends and relatives that she was going to be a billionaire when she grew up. Elizabeth is quoted as saying, "I had the blessing of being able to figure out what I wanted to do very early, and I was very interested in the concept of creating things." Elizabeth was described as being a very serious, driven, and motivated child. She was also described as having an intense competitive streak and wanted to win every game or competition, no matter how insignificant. Family members recall Elizabeth showing extreme competitiveness with board games, especially Monopoly, and she would play until the very end, even if it took hours. If she didn't win, she would storm off, one time even running through a screen door. When she was young, the family moved to Houston, Texas, and Elizabeth attended St. John's School for high school. She was very studious and hardworking, often staying up all night to finish projects or write papers. Her senior quote was, "Dream, laugh, reach for the stars." And she said that her best friend in high school was books. Around this time, Elizabeth's uncle was diagnosed with skin cancer that eventually turned into brain cancer, and he died. Elizabeth was close with her uncle, and she took his passing very hard. In 2001, after she graduated high school, she attended Stanford, where she studied chemical engineering. Just like in high school, Elizabeth was extremely driven and motivated. In the 2019 documentary, The Inventor, Out for Blood in Silicon Valley, one of Elizabeth's professors was interviewed. Dr. Phyllis Gardner, professor of medicine at Stanford, recalls 19-year-old Elizabeth bringing her a patent for a small patch that would sample blood, detect infection, and immediately deliver antibiotics. Gardner explained to her that this was physically impossible because antibiotics aren't potent enough, and this is why we have to use IV bags. Elizabeth didn't want to accept this and came to Gardner 2 more times with modifications, and both times Gardner explained that this technology simply wasn't possible. But Elizabeth wouldn't take no for an answer, and she went to her advisor, Channing Robertson, the head of the science department at Stanford. When asked about Elizabeth, Robertson said, quote, "From the very first time I met her, it was very clear she was unusual. I've taught tens of thousands of students at Stanford, and I knew right away that I was dealing with something very, very different." End quote. Elizabeth spent a summer in Singapore working in the Genome Institute lab, a job she was qualified for because she had taught herself Mandarin in high school. She came back feeling inspired and motivated and convinced Robertson to take a chance on her and to help her start her own company. Soon after, Elizabeth dropped out of Stanford before receiving a degree. She was in the works of inventing a new medical device and constructing her own company, and believed that going to class was a waste of her time and money. To those around her, Elizabeth justified this decision by bringing up the fact that many powerful and successful people had dropped out of college before, including Steve Jobs. In fact, Elizabeth became obsessed with Jobs and began to emulate him, including wearing only black. She slowly began to care less about her appearance and often had messy hair tucked into her turtlenecks and wore little to no makeup. Her eyes are big, and people around her often noted that she never seemed to blink and was always incredibly stoic. And perhaps the most interesting of her characteristics is her deep baritone voice. I'm going to play you a clip from her TED Talk.
The individual is the answer to the challenges of healthcare, but we can't engage the individual in changing outcomes unless individuals have access to the information they need to do so.
Her deep voice, combined with her black wardrobe and unblinking eyes, gave the appearance of someone incredibly strong and powerful who was not to be taken lightly. Soon after dropping out of Stanford, Elizabeth revealed the medical device and company that she had been secretly building. The company she named Theranos, which was a combination of the words therapy and diagnosis, and the revolutionary medical device she called the Nanotator, a tiny glass capsule that could hold enough blood to run multiple blood tests at once. Elizabeth's vision was for healthcare to be more affordable and accessible to the public. The goal of the Nanotator was to prick someone's finger and get enough blood to run a host of tests so that people no longer had to endure lengthy and painful blood tests that required tubes and tubes of blood. She wanted early detection for everyone so that people like her uncle, who died from cancer, could catch their illnesses and diseases in their early stages. Her motto was, quote, "So nobody has to say goodbye too soon," end quote. This vision of hers also required a machine to run these blood tests, a tiny black box the size of a printer she named the Edison machine. The basic layout for this system is that the tiny glass capsule, or the Nanotator, would collect the blood from someone's finger. The Nanotator would go into the Edison, and within an hour or so, the Edison would print out the results for up to 200 different blood tests. Channing Robertson, her former advisor at Stanford and her business mentor, asked her, "Why do you want to do this?" And she said, quote, "Because systems like this could completely revolutionize how effective healthcare is delivered. And this is what I want to do. I don't want to make an incremental change in some technology in my life. I want to create a whole new technology, and one that is aimed at helping humanity at all levels, regardless of geography or ethnicity or age or gender." End quote. Initially, Elizabeth used her remaining Stanford tuition money to start up Theranos, and the company began working for pharmaceutical companies. But Elizabeth quickly decided that she wanted to make Theranos a private company, one that she was the CEO of. Before Theranos even had a headquarters, she began campaigning for investors' money, and she quickly got it. Without any scientific or financial records and going off of Elizabeth's word, promises, and revolutionary vision alone, she soon had millions of dollars and had very powerful and affluent investors backing her company. Many of these private investors were well-known people in the business and tech industries, including Avi Tevanian, who was a computer scientist at Apple. She also quickly began to build a board of directors, a group of men who were a who's who in business and politics. The board included General Mattis, a former military commander, Dick Kovakovich, former CEO of Wells Fargo, Sam Nunn, a senator, Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, and George Shultz, former Secretary of State. All of these men trusted Elizabeth wholeheartedly and believed in her goal of radically changing the healthcare system forever and making their mark on history. By 2004, Theranos had officially opened their headquarters in Palo Alto, California. Every month, Theranos seemed to grow bigger, and along with it, Elizabeth only grew more successful. She was seen by many as a pioneer in the medical industry and was even compared to historical figures such as Beethoven. However, along with her success also came some critics. Elizabeth's former Stanford professor, Phyllis Gardner, said that she could see right through her tactics. She believed that Elizabeth didn't really want scientific input or people around her that would look into the technology or medicine behind Theranos, but instead wanted businessmen and politicians who really weren't even qualified to be doing this job. All of these board members were older, powerful white men who seemed to follow her charm instead of the facts that backed up her claims. Gardner theorized that Elizabeth wanted influential government members around her so she could sell her product to the military, but when she was asked about this, she would always change the subject. In some marketing materials, Theranos made up a quote from General Mattis that said they were going to use the Edison machine on wounded soldiers on the front line of combat, something he claims to have never said. The Pentagon asked for an Edison machine to test before they allowed it to be used in the military, but Elizabeth denied their request and said that she wouldn't allow the machines to be used without her assistance and that she wanted to tightly guard the technology. But even with the secrecy surrounding the technology and practices of the company and their equipment, Theranos just kept growing and setting their eyes on new goals. Eventually, Elizabeth knew she couldn't run the company alone, and she brought on Sunny Balwani, a businessman who had expertise in software and IT. Quickly, Sunny and Elizabeth, who had a 20-year age difference, began a romantic relationship and soon began leaving work together in the evenings and arriving at work together in the mornings. Theranos employees said that Sunny seemed infatuated with Elizabeth and saw her as a revolutionary figure who was changing the world. The more the two of them worked together, the more secretive they became, not only with their relationship, but also with Theranos as a whole. They were constantly traveling together and having confidential meetings, all of which was kept from the 800 employees Theranos was now employing. In her vision of making healthcare accessible to all, Elizabeth and her team had their eyes set on bigger and better things, which included taking their Edison machines to the public. They began shopping the machines around, marketing them as portable blood testing machines that could be used in retail settings, looking for companies to take a chance on them, and Walgreens decided to jump on board. The goal was to put the Edisons in a few select Walgreens in Arizona and eventually have them in every Walgreens in Arizona, then every Walgreens in America. They wanted people to be able to come in on their lunch break, have a finger prick, and leave with their test results. Walgreens agreed to this and went ahead with opening these so-called wellness centers, all without ever actually looking inside one of the Edison machines. Walgreens executives came to the Theranos headquarters in Palo Alto to have a test run of the system. The executives had their fingers pricked, and a small blood sample was put into the nanotator capsule. The nanotator was then put into the machine to run the test. During this time, Elizabeth and Sonny gave them a tour and had a meeting while they believed that their blood was inside the Edison machine. However, employees at Theranos said that something else was actually happening behind closed doors. After the blood was put into the Edison and they left the room, an engineer would run in, take out the nanotator, and bring it to their lab downstairs. There, they would do the test by hand as quickly as possible, print out the results, run back into the room, and replace the nanotator. The executive came back in from their tour and believed that in that short period, the Edison had run their blood test and printed their results. They were also under the impression that the Edison could run 200 tests, when, in reality, the workers in the lab downstairs could only complete less than 100. While Theranos and the Edisons looked like a well-oiled machine on the outside that simply seemed too good to be true, inside it was a disaster. The Edison had been having problems since the very beginning of its development, and it could never actually deliver on its promise of running a comprehensive lab test off the blood from a fingertip prick. Theranos tried fixing every element on the Edison one by one, including even changing the color of the machine, and each time they would introduce it as new cutting-edge technology. But inside, it was a complete mess. The machines couldn't regulate their temperatures or properly transfer fluids. The nanotators were falling over and shattering inside, spilling blood all over and leaving shards of glass that workers were cutting their hands on. Theranos often took volunteers from the street and offered them money for blood samples, but wouldn't screen them for diseases such as hepatitis or AIDS first. With the nanotators shattering, workers were getting cut and scraped and were exposed to blood from possibly infected individuals. The machines would often freeze up or shake violently, and workers would have to open up the machine and put their hands inside to fix it. Engineers within Theranos began to raise concerns about the Edison, claiming that the technology they wanted couldn't fit inside such a small machine and that the Edison needed to be much larger. Elizabeth and Sonny, however, were adamant that the Edison must be light and portable so that it appealed to the masses, and they wouldn't take no for an answer. When employees would bring up their doubts or concerns, they would be gaslighted, and Sonny or Elizabeth would say things such as, "Well, maybe you're not cut out for a job in Silicon Valley, and if you don't share the vision of the company, you should look elsewhere." Sonny and Elizabeth both didn't seem to care whether or not the technology was working, and if they were told no, they would simply move down the line to younger and less experienced employees until someone would tell them yes. Ian Gibbons was one of these employees who began to raise some doubts about Theranos. He was an expert in blood testing and one of the first people hired in the company. He began to bring up the issues with the technology, and other employees noticed that he was slowly pushed out from the company, including giving him less responsibility and eventually completely taking away his office. In 2013, Theranos faced a patent lawsuit. Elizabeth's original patent that was granted was for, quote, medical devices and methods capable of real-time detection of biological activity and the controlled and localized release of appropriate therapeutic agents, end quote. The patent employee who reviewed her case granted her the patent without ever seeing an actual machine or making sure it actually worked. Unfortunately, the patent examination process in the U.S. is extremely oversaturated, with 600,000 patents being submitted last year. The lawsuit that Theranos was up against was essentially that they couldn't actually deliver on what their patent said they could do. Elizabeth was afraid that Ian Gibbons would expose Theranos at the lawsuit hearing, and they were trying to keep him from testifying, including telling him not to come into the office and to work from home instead. Ian's wife, Rochelle, says that he was extremely distraught leading up to the date of the hearing and fell into a depression and began drinking heavily. He wanted to do the right thing and stand his ground, but was terrified of losing his job and ruining the career he had worked so hard to build. Ian asked his wife if she thought that he would be fired, to which she said yes. That night, Ian Gibbons killed himself. Rochelle Gibbons says that nobody at the company, including Elizabeth, ever spoke to her after his suicide. There was never a card sent or flowers delivered. She said the only correspondence she ever had with Theranos again was when she received a letter in the mail asking her to return all of the confidential documents that Ian kept at their home, which she returned to the front desk of the Theranos office. Theranos employees said that around this time, especially after the death of Ian, that things around the office became even more tense, and Elizabeth and Sonny both grew extremely paranoid. A work environment that was already secretive became almost silent. Elizabeth was worried that information was being leaked and that their technology would be stolen from competitors such as Quest Labs, or that another company was going to beat them to something. She hired guards to stand outside the building, as well as 2 guards to stand outside her office. She barricaded herself inside and worked until the wee hours of the morning, with most employees no longer even seeing her around the office. She had bulletproof glass installed around her office, and bodyguards used the code names Eagle 1 and Eagle 2 to refer to her and Sonny. Employees were given key cards that had to be swiped when they entered a room. They all had to sign non-disclosure agreements, promising that they wouldn't talk about the company or their job to anyone, including their families. Erica Chung, who worked in the lab, said that they would send emails to one another without Elizabeth or Sonny CC'd on them, but that Sonny would respond, meaning that he was monitoring their emails. The tension also began to trickle down to the employees themselves. Work that was once done in groups or a collaborative effort turned into individual work, with everyone keeping their heads down and keeping to themselves. Elizabeth didn't want employees to work together, ask questions, or troubleshoot issues, but encouraged them to just keep trying alone if something didn't work. In 2013, the Walgreens Wellness Centers with the Edison machines began opening in Arizona. And although the machines were still having the same problems, Theranos pushed ahead because they were running out of money. They hoped that opening these wellness centers would attract new investors, which it did, including Betsy DeVos and Rupert Murdoch. Walgreens and Theranos were telling the public that they could come in, get their finger pricked, and would have their results within a few hours. However, because the Edisons weren't actually capable of this technology, the blood was being expedited to Palo Alto, run manually there, and sent back to Arizona, taking just as long as a regular blood test. Most of the Walgreens employees performing the finger test weren't qualified, and neither were the lab workers back at the Theranos office. In fact, when the lab director quit, they replaced them with a dermatologist. Arizona residents began taking their results to their doctors and telling them that they got their blood tested at Walgreens with a new machine. This concerned many doctors, including Dr. Stephanie Seitz, who tried contacting Theranos multiple times to ask them about their methods and practices. She said she often called labs with questions, but Theranos was the only one to never return her calls. She began telling her patients not to do the Theranos blood test because she had major doubts about their legitimacy. Soon after the Edisons hit Walgreens, Theranos unveiled a new marketing campaign. Elizabeth hired Errol Morris, who had done advertising for Apple. They ran commercials with people discussing how the Theranos blood test saved their life. They ran magazine articles with the new motto, "Simple, Human, Optimistic." And they even began selling Theranos gift cards for people to give to their friends and family. They created a blood testing menu with all of their tests listed with the price next to them a la carte style. $10 for ammonia testing, $7.87 for barbiturates test, $3.55 for calcium, and $15 for a host of cancer antigens. This began to raise even more concerns amongst the medical community. Patients were leaving Walgreens with their test results in hand, instead of them being sent to their doctor, causing many people to misread and misinterpret their results. Dr. Stephanie Seitz said that she had many patients come to her thinking they had deadly diseases, including cancer, based off of their Theranos results. Within the first year, Theranos opened 10 more Walgreens wellness centers, which completely overwhelmed employees back at the headquarters. Elizabeth told investors and the media that the technology was progressing and the system was getting even more streamlined and automated, all while lab workers at the Theranos headquarters were still running these tests by hand. Employee Erica Chung said that the process was extremely time-consuming, and setting up each day took several hours. They began using more and more different brands of machines in order to keep up with the high demand. However, many of these machines couldn't process the blood samples from the nanotators, so the blood had to be diluted, which was producing inaccurate results. Theranos employees knew that the machines weren't working properly and they were giving people inaccurate results. But nobody wanted to speak up in fear that it would jeopardize their career or the future of the company. Engineer Tyler Schultz said that he was running precision testing for syphilis and that there was way too much variability in the test, and he knew it wasn't producing accurate results. He said if 100 people came in and tested positive for syphilis, only 65 of them would have come up positive in the Theranos program, therefore allowing infected people to go around spreading syphilis without even knowing it. The entire company of Theranos was winging it every day, not sure of what they were doing or how long they could keep it up for. Engineer Tyler Schultz said that Theranos seemed to have two different worlds, the carpeted world and the tiled world. He said, quote, "The carpeted world is where Elizabeth was a goddess. Everyone worshipped the ground that she walked on. She could do no wrong. She was the next Steve Jobs. Theranos was changing the world. And then you go into the tile side and nothing works. We're on a sinking ship. Everything's a lie." End quote. He said whenever he felt discouraged by the tile side, he would talk to Elizabeth and she would motivate him to keep working and tell him that they were changing the world, and it would inspire him to keep going. He would go back to the lab and realize that it was all just a lie that he wanted to believe so badly. He said that Elizabeth was so convincing that it made him think maybe he was the crazy one. Elizabeth was attending parties, receiving prestigious awards, appearing on magazine covers, and hanging out with celebrities and politicians. He thought there was no way one woman could have all these rich and powerful people duped. So he, like most other employees, kept their heads down and just kept working. One day, employee Erica Chung went to Sunny and said that she had concerns that patients weren't getting accurate results, and he told her that she wasn't qualified to make that call and that she needed to sit down and just do her job. This is when Erica decided to leave Theranos, and she began to realize that Elizabeth Holmes was a hypocrite. Someone who preached about making healthcare more accessible and affordable to the masses was actually lying to them and giving them false information about their own health. Within a 6-month span, Elizabeth had articles about her in both Fortune magazine and The New Yorker. The New Yorker article, written by Ken Aletta, entitled Blood Simpler, described Elizabeth as, quote, "Although she can quote Jane Austen by heart, she no longer devotes time to novels or friends, doesn't date, doesn't own a television, and hasn't taken a vacation in 10 years. Her refrigerator is all but empty as she eats most of her meals at the office. She is a vegan, and several times a day she drinks a pulverized concoction of cucumber, parsley, kale, spinach, romaine lettuce, and celery." End quote. For the article, Ken Aletta asked Elizabeth to see an Edison machine and wanted to know how it worked. He said, quote, "What exactly happens in the machines is treated as a state secret," and Holmes's description of the process was comically vague. She said, "A chemistry is performed so that a chemical reaction occurs and generates a signal from the chemical interaction with the sample, which is translated into a result, which is then reviewed by certified laboratory personnel," end quote. Something that sounds like a lot, but isn't really actually saying anything. Elizabeth kept pushing forward and started selling the idea that just like Apple, she wanted Theranos to be a household name, and she wanted an Edison machine in every American home. But aside from the fact that the Edisons weren't working properly, there was another glaring detail. The Edisons still had not been approved by the FDA. In the same article by Ken Aletta, he asked her about the Edisons being FDA approved, and she danced around the question and said that she had to speak to her legal team, never giving him a direct answer. Theranos was submitting single tests to the FDA instead of submitting the Edison as a whole, and therefore would take years to be approved, purposely buying them precious time. Theranos was also in trouble with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, the federal agency overseeing the Palo Alto lab. Supposedly, Theranos was only giving them data from the third-party machines they used in the lab, no actual data from the Edisons themselves. This concerned employees because Theranos was basically saying the results were good enough to send to real patients, but not good enough to send to the government for review. When CMS came in for a scheduled meeting, Elizabeth moved everyone out of the lab and made employees stay at their desks. They showed CMS the results from the third-party machines they were using, but never even took them downstairs to the lab where the Edisons were computing the finger prick tests. This was the last straw for Tyler Schultz, and he too decided to quit. But little did he know, someone else was beginning to investigate Theranos behind closed doors. John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal was approached by an anonymous source who knew the Theranos lab director who had just quit on bad terms. Carreyrou called this former lab director who was scared to talk because Theranos had hired famed lawyer David Boies, the man who had represented Al Gore in the presidential election recount and went on to represent Harvey Weinstein. Carreyrou agreed to keep his identity secret if he shared his information. The individual told him that the Edisons could run a few tests, but not the 200 tests that Theranos offered, and that the tests were mostly ran on machines owned by other companies. He also said the results were often incorrect and skewed. Carreyrou decided to travel to Arizona and visit one of these Walgreens wellness centers for himself. When he sat down, the Walgreens employee informed him that the tests he ordered required him to use a traditional tourniquet and blood vials, referred to as a venipuncture, not the finger prick test that Theranos was advertising. And it turns out that the majority of people going to these Walgreens testing centers were being told the same thing. Within the first year of the Walgreens center's opening, the majority of tests were being done traditionally, not even using the finger prick test. Workers at Walgreens were told to tell patients the following general statement, quote, "Due to the tests that your physician ordered, we have to perform venipuncture to make sure that we have enough sample to perform the testing. Would you like to proceed?" End quote. After his experience, Carreyrou knew that he was on to something and that he had to pursue this story. He contacted Tyler Schultz, who had just left Theranos. Tyler was apprehensive about returning Carreyrou's phone call because he had signed confidentiality agreements with Theranos and was scared of the legal ramifications. However, he believed that exposing Theranos was the right thing to do, so he purchased a burner phone and called John Carreyrou and decided to give him information for his Wall Street Journal article. Over the next few months, Carreyrou worked closely with Tyler and other former Theranos employees to get a clear picture of what exactly was happening within the company and what exactly Elizabeth and her followers were trying to hide. Around this time, Erica Chung, who had left Theranos and started a new job, noticed that a man had been parked in her work parking lot all day, and none of her coworkers knew who it was. That night, when she walked to her car, the man got out and handed her a letter with the address of a temporary place she was staying, an address she didn't have while working at Theranos. It was a letter from Theranos written by their lawyer, David Boies, and it said that if she didn't come forward with some information, the Theranos would sue her. Soon after, Tyler Schultz received a phone call from his grandfather, George Schultz, who was the former Secretary of State and one of the first investors in Theranos. George told his grandson Tyler that Elizabeth had been tipped off about the Wall Street Journal article and that she knew Tyler was helping. Tyler's grandfather told him that if he went through with providing classified information to John Carreyrou, that his career would be ruined forever. His grandfather told him to come over to his house and sign a non-disclosure agreement to basically make it all go away. Tyler, now intimidated by Elizabeth's threats and afraid of never working again, agreed. However, when he arrived at his grandfather's home, there were two Theranos lawyers present who, instead of providing him with a non-disclosure, gave him a notice to appear in court the next day and a temporary restraining order against him. Tyler got into a verbal altercation with the lawyers, explaining that what Theranos was doing was illegal and that they were being reckless with the public's health. Tyler tried to explain to his grandfather that Elizabeth wasn't who she pretended to be and that he needed to withdraw himself from the company as well. Tyler, hoping that he was changing his grandfather's mind and opening his eyes to the harsh reality, was stunned when his grandfather sided with the lawyers and defended Elizabeth and Theranos. Although Tyler never actually ended up having to appear in court, he says that the legal battle which ensued for him was massive. He was constantly being called, emailed, and written by lawyers, bullying him into keeping his mouth shut. He said that his parents spent around $500,000 on his legal fees and even ended up selling their home to keep him out of jail. With all of the drama and chaos going on in the background, Elizabeth maintained her outer appearance of the driven and strong businesswoman. While the Wall Street Journal article was being written, Elizabeth distracted her 800 employees by throwing a massive company party to celebrate being FDA approved. However, the Edison itself hadn't been approved. Only one test, a herpes test, had been approved. The party had lots of booze, DJs, and bouncy houses. Elizabeth and Sonny preached to the crowd of excited employees about how revolutionary this day was and how important their vision was. They talked about how competitors such as Quest Labs were intimidated by them and trying to steal their ideas, but it would never work. It ended with the entire company yelling in unison, "Fuck you," to Quest Labs. Theranos employees described this time in the company as euphoria and said that attitudes seemed to be shifting and that Elizabeth and Sonny seemed like they were on cloud 9. The company seemed to be doing better than ever when really it was crumbling from the inside out. In October of 2015, the Wall Street Journal article written by John Carreyrou entitled "Hot Startup Theranos Has Struggled with Its Blood Test Technology" was published. Immediately, people took notice. The article specifically highlighted Theranos' inaccurate results, compared real patients' Theranos blood results to other well-known labs, and shared the statistic that only 10% of the blood tests were actually being run on the Edison machines. Carreyrou said that within a day, he knew the story was making a massive impact and his inbox was flooded with media appearance requests. Carreyrou said he believes that it was a wake-up call for Silicon Valley as a whole, and that all these startups being so secretive and not having to show reports to investors made a lot of room for fraud and deception. Fortune magazine's Roger Parloff, who had spent a lot of time with Elizabeth, written a comprehensive article about Theranos, and gotten Elizabeth on the cover of Fortune magazine, said he immediately called Elizabeth to clear this up. The receptionist said that Elizabeth wouldn't be in for a few days because she was actually attending an awards ceremony. Roger Parloff said, quote, "I was just stunned. The Wall Street Journal has just said that you're a fraud and that your company is a fraud. The company I put on the front of the magazine is a fraud, and you're going to spend the whole day hiding out in this honorary horseshit. You need to get out here and go through this article paragraph by paragraph, explaining what the fuck's going on at your company." End quote. When Elizabeth returned from this awards ceremony, she gathered her employees and told them that the allegations made by John Carreyrou simply weren't true and that they were going to fight the Wall Street Journal with everything they had. Elizabeth went on the popular TV show Mad Money and spoke with Jim Cramer and said, quote, "This is what happens when you work to change things. First, they think you're crazy. Then they fight you. Then all of a sudden, you change the world. And I have to say, I personally was shocked to see that the journal would publish something like this. Every single one of the sources that we spoke with who the journal had contacted told us that the statements that were being attributed to them were false or misleading." End quote. Theranos also made an official statement saying the article was false and factually and scientifically erroneous. John Carreyrou reached out to Elizabeth numerous times to sit down with her and discuss the article, which she finally agreed to after a few months. She said she would only meet with him at the Wall Street Journal offices, and she brought with her a team of 7 people, including 4 lawyers. Carreyrou said 2 lawyers put down recorders, and it was clear it was being treated as a legal meeting, so he put down a recorder too. All questions he had about the Theranos technology were answered vaguely and hostilely. They said that the information was trade secrets and was kept private to protect the information from competitors. Carrie Rue brought up that the majority of the work was being done on third-party machines, not the Edisons. So how could it be trade secrets if they weren't actually even using the new technology? The team again was defensive, saying it seemed like he wanted to know the exact technology of the machine so that he himself could steal it. The lawyers brought up the fact that he had been working with Tyler Schultz because some of his concerns were the exact verbatim concerns that Tyler also had. Carrie Rue said he ended the meeting knowing that he was right in pursuing this story and that their behavior and lack of answers only solidified his belief that this company was a fraud. Around the time of this meeting, Theranos had another visit from CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, but this time it was a surprise visit, and they had no time to prepare like the previous time. CMS found that the testing was so inaccurate that it posed, quote, immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety, end quote, and they revoked their license to operate. However, CMS wasn't prompted to act based off of the Wall Street Journal article, but instead were tipped off from an email that ex-employee Erica Chung had written them, whistleblowing the company. The revocation of their license also prompted the FDA to ban all use of the nanitator, the tiny glass capsule used to collect the finger prick test blood samples. Through this all, Elizabeth didn't skip a beat. She continued to do media appearances, answering hostile questions from interviewers and the public by continuing to lie about the technology. She began backpedaling, not being able to answer questions, contradicting herself from one interview to another, and becoming flustered. She tried whatever she could to divert attention away from the problem, including introducing even newer technology that her and her team were working on. She seemed to be grasping at straws and finding anyone or anything she could point the finger at. In an interview with Maria Shriver, Elizabeth said, quote, at the highest level, we didn't have the right leadership in the laboratory, and I didn't realize until the inspection that these types of issues were in place, end quote. Maria Shriver asked, quote, so until the government told you that you were really out of compliance, you didn't know? To which Elizabeth replied, yeah. Fortune magazine's Roger Parloff wrote another article, this time stating that when he wrote his previous article and had Elizabeth on the cover, that she was intentionally misleading him. Elizabeth quickly called and threatened that if he didn't take that sentence out, she would pursue legal action. He didn't take it out. Parloff said he began to reflect and analyze on the time that he had spent with Elizabeth and his relationship with her, including many dinners, meetings, and meeting her entire family. He came to the conclusion that there had to be something mentally wrong with Elizabeth to be able to pull something like this off for so many years. He said, quote, I realized there was something wrong with her mind. I don't know if she's lying or if she has a subconscious reconstruction of reality that's going on, but what is coming out of her mouth is not mapping onto reality as you or I know it, end quote. And Roger Parloff wasn't the only one trying to analyze Elizabeth's behavior and try to figure out how all of this had happened. Dan Ariely, a Duke professor of psychology and behavioral economics, met with Elizabeth. He said, quote, part of my research is about human motivation, and she was very concerned about demotivation within the company because the continuous stories around them were demotivating. My impression was that she truly believes in the mission of the company and that she also believed that they were on the way to achieve something and they just needed the runway, end quote. Ariely says he believes that the mindset in Silicon Valley as a whole may be to blame because companies knowingly lie to the public and investors. He said, quote, there is this idea in Silicon Valley where you, in a very brave way, put the post somewhere really far and you truly have no idea if you can really even get there, end quote. Elizabeth, refusing to give up, went to a medical conference where she finally showed the technology behind the Edison, which she was now calling the mini lab. But investors and the public were no longer buying what she was trying to sell. By 2017, Theranos had no money left of the $9 billion they had raised. They had settlements, had to refund every person in Arizona who had gotten a blood test, and $3 billion alone went to legal fees. One by one, members of the board resigned. Elizabeth simultaneously broke up with and fired boyfriend and business partner Sunny Balwani. In 2018, Theranos officially dissolved, and Elizabeth and Sunny were both charged with conspiracy and fraud. They both pled not guilty. Elizabeth agreed to pay a $500,000 fine and give back $18 million to stockholders. She isn't allowed to be the director or officer of a publicly traded company for 10 years. Elizabeth and Sunny's trial will begin in July of this year, and they both face up to 20 years in prison. Elizabeth resides in San Francisco and is reportedly now married to Billy Evans, heir to hospitality company Evans Hotel Group. In October of 2019, the three lawyers representing Elizabeth said they want off the case because they haven't been paid in more than a year. The judge is yet to rule if they can be off the case or not. Former Theranos employees, board members, and those close to Elizabeth during her time at Theranos have the collective belief that they were truly duped by Elizabeth and the dream that she was trying to sell. Nobody truly knows what the motivation behind Elizabeth's actions really were, or how much of her public persona was true to her real self. Many believe that she was playing a character of someone she so badly wanted to be, but didn't have the knowledge or experience to actually be. That she hid her real self as a defense mechanism to protect herself from reality and the repercussions her actions would have. Many even speculate that her well-recognized and unique deep masculine voice was fake too. Research shows that women with lower voices are considered more trustworthy, stronger, and more competent by their peers, and many believe that Elizabeth was trying to convey the same type of persona. Nobody close to Elizabeth or Elizabeth herself have answered any questions regarding her voice. Some former Theranos employees have said that they heard her voice change on some very rare occasions, including an employee who said she was very excited about something and her voice got really high. Then she cleared her throat and it returned to her deep voice. However, there appear to be only 2 audio sources that have actually captured her voice change. This first one is from the Biotech Nation Radio podcast from 2005.
No, it hasn't. Well, if I use traditional words to describe what we're doing, it's hard because people then associate it with conventional processes for analyzing drugs in development or whatever aspects we may.
So at the very beginning, you can hear her voice is a lot higher, then it switches back into her deep voice. And the second clip is from a talk she was giving to the American Association for Clinical Chemistry.
To integrate multiple methods onto a single platform for the first time. We know there's a lot of questions about the past, and in the appropriate forum, we'll address those. But today, we're hoping to be able to engage on a scientific exchange on this platform.
So again, at the beginning, you can hear her voice is much higher, and then when she realizes what's happening, it goes back down to her deeper voice. So what exactly is Elizabeth Holmes, and what was the motivation behind her unethical, illegal, and fraudulent actions? The theories about her are vast and extreme. Many think that Elizabeth is a textbook narcissist, which the Mayo Clinic defines as, quote, a disorder in which a person has an inflated sense of self-importance. Symptoms include an excessive need for admiration, disregard for others' feelings, an inability to handle any criticism, and a sense of entitlement, end quote. Marie Line Germain, Associate Professor of Human Resources and Leadership at Western Carolina University, says, quote, narcissists can only be understood by or should connect with other extraordinary people who support their brilliant ideas. Those who don't support them and their ideas have no place in their lives, end quote. Germain says that some other qualities of a narcissist are, quote, avoiding conflict, smudging the truth, burying themselves in work, blaming others for mistakes, pretending they're martyrs, building alliances, and threatening lawsuits, end quote. Many rich and powerful business people, including many CEOs, are actually narcissists, and they rise to power through their lack of empathy and desire to reach their goals, no matter who it might destroy along the way. Although narcissists do tend to be men, there are definitely also some women who have this disorder. Many in online forums such as Reddit believe that deep down, Elizabeth was a cutthroat businesswoman who only wanted fame, money, and notoriety. They see her as a villain who scammed billions of dollars from investors and lied to the public about their health for years. They see her as a hypocrite who preached her vision of making healthcare more affordable, more accessible, and less painful, all while she was actually making the healthcare system more corrupt and less trustworthy. Many believe she knew from the very beginning that the technology she advertised wasn't ever going to be possible and that she didn't care. They believe that she should be in jail and have to legally pay for the crimes she committed and for the thousands of people she duped. They believe that she was out for blood, literally. However, some believe that Elizabeth isn't a monster, but instead was an overzealous businesswoman who got in over her head. Many believe that she followed the motto of fake it until you make it and hoped that things would eventually work if she just kept trying. That if she put in the time, effort, and money into Theranos, that anything truly was possible. Some believe that she kept going in the hopes that technology would catch up and that the Edison machine could actually work, and she was just buying time until then. They believe that her vision got clouded by the success and money that surrounded her, and instead of admit defeat and let down her 800 employees and lose her millions of invested dollars, that she just hunkered down and kept working, reaching for a goal that she wasn't even sure of. Perhaps she wanted Theranos to succeed so bad that she couldn't swallow her pride and own up to her mistakes. That instead of admitting the problems with the technology and within the company, she used her money to cover up her lies and deceptions and built a hole too big to climb out of. Since the end of Theranos, the interest and intrigue around Elizabeth Holmes has only grown. An HBO documentary called The Inventor, Out for Blood in Silicon Valley, was released in 2019. In 2018, John Carreyrou published his book Bad Blood: Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup. And in 2019, the podcast The Dropout about Elizabeth debuted. The internet is still abuzz with talk of Elizabeth. The subreddit dedicated to her and Theranos is still very active, and there are talks of a movie coming soon starring Jennifer Lawrence as Holmes. So what is our fascination with Elizabeth and her story, or imposters, scammers, and con artists in general? Maria Konnikova, a psychologist and the author of the book The Confidence Game: Why We Fall for It Every Time, says that, quote, "It's easier for us to be fascinated by them because human beings are always fascinated by crime. But when it's con artists or mobsters, you feel like you have permission because you don't think of it as a violent crime. Instead, you can say, oh, look, someone's living by their wits. They're fooling people. That is so cool." It's also easier to discount the victims when it's a matter of con artists because you can always say, this wasn't really so bad. Or you can actually just downplay the victim's humanity, which happens a lot. Think about the sayings that we have about the victims of con artists. You can't fool an honest man. Things like that. Right away, it's almost like victim blamings. You're saying, well, if you weren't gullible, you wouldn't have fallen for it. Victims can be incredibly smart, honest, not greedy people, and con artists really do ruin lives and hurt people a lot, end quote. Many also believe that we are fascinated by Elizabeth's story in particular because she was a young, attractive woman and kind of an underdog in the sense that she never actually graduated or got a degree. In his 2018 book, John Carreyrou says, quote, "I think the chief reason people are so fascinated is that the main character is a woman, and a young woman at that, in a world dominated by men. She was going to be the first female to succeed on the scale of Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs. When it turned out she was a fraud, it threw people for a loop and pulled them down the rabbit hole," end quote. And journalist Maura Walters said in an interview with Vogue, quote, "The idea of Holmes, once a bona fide media darling, as a rare woman startup founder in the Silicon Valley Boys Club only made me more captivated and frankly more let down by her downfall. I think we all wanted to believe in the bold, driven female in the male-dominated room, despite her inexperience and myriad red flags," end quote. And when asked what he thought to be Elizabeth's motivation, John Carreyrou said, quote, "What was going through Holmes's head fascinated me to no end. Is she completely delusional? Is she just a bald-faced liar and psychopath? Or is it a mixture of the two? I believe she started out with good intentions, but along the way she cut corners and started telling lies, and those lies snowballed. End quote. So, what do you guys think of Elizabeth Holmes and the story of Theranos? Had you heard about this before this episode, or is this completely new to you? I tend to lean towards the sentiment of John Carreyrou that Elizabeth began her journey with good intentions that got out of hand. I think she was overly eager and wanted to make her mark on history so badly that she didn't think things through to the end. I don't think she really ever even had an end game other than to be successful, and she just made things up as she went. I don't think she's evil or malicious or wanted to cause harm, but she did, and I think she definitely deserves to serve some jail time. She swindled investors out of billions of dollars and straight up lied to the public for years. People were getting inaccurate test results, sometimes being misdiagnosed, freaking out that they had diseases they didn't have, and oftentimes actually having a disease that went undiagnosed. I think that what separates Elizabeth Holmes from the majority of people isn't how smart or special she was, but the fact that she kept going when she knew things were going very wrong. There are lots of people in this world who are driven and want success and want great things for humanity, but I would like to think that the vast majority of people would speak up when they know that they're in over their heads. She lied to people for years and never had the strength to swallow her pride and admit that things weren't working. And I believe that if her and her partner Sonny were actually punished for their crimes, that it may detour some other companies from possibly doing the same things. It's 2020 now, and with the amount of technology and resources we have, I think that we need to hold companies, especially medical ones, to a higher standard than this. But as always, please let me know what you guys think. I'm curious, do you think Elizabeth Holmes is a delusional narcissist? Do you think that she just got in over her head and couldn't find her way out? I want to know your thoughts. Please reach out to me and let me know. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Weird on the Rocks Podcast, Twitter at Weird_Rocks, and the website weirdontherocks.weebly.com. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and until next time, cheers and stay weird.
That was a Titancast episode.